Nicholas Baird's polished leather shoes clicked against the marble floor as he stormed toward the glass doors of his corporate headquarters, his patience already wearing thin from a morning filled with disappointing quarterly brr reports. The 6-year-old boy bouncing a rubber ball against the pristine wall of his building was about to receive the full force of his fury. What Nick didn't know was that this child's presence here wasn't random, that the worn sneakers and tired eyes told a story of hospital waiting rooms and sleepless nights, and that the man fighting for his life 3 blocks away had once been the most important person in Nick's world. Sometimes the universe has a way of forcing us to remember who we used to be, and sometimes it takes a child's tears to wash away years of carefully constructed walls. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished granite plaza surrounding Baird Industries' 40-story headquarters in downtown Seattle. Nicholas Baird adjusted his platinum cufflinks as he stepped out of his black Tesla Model S, the vehicle's door closing with the satisfying thud that only came with engineering precision and a price tag exceeding $100,000. At 38, Nick had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into a multinational corporation worth over $2 billion. His tailored charcoal suit, handcrafted Italian leather shoes, and Patek Philippe watch, worth more than most people's annual salaries, announced his success to the world before he even opened his mouth. The morning air carried the usual sounds of downtown Seattle, traffic humming in the distance, construction crews beginning their daily routines, and the faint murmur of early commuters hurrying to their destinations. Nick breathed in deeply, savoring the crisp October air and the sense of control that came with arriving at his domain each morning. This was his kingdom, built through relentless ambition, calculated risks, and an unwavering commitment to excellence that had earned him both admiration and fear in equal measure. His reverie was shattered by a rhythmic thudding sound that seemed to pierce through the morning calm like nails on a chalkboard. Nick's jaw tightened as he located the source of the disturbance. A small boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old, was bouncing a worn red rubber ball against the pristine white marble wall of his building's facade. The child's concentration was complete, his tongue poking out slightly from the corner of his mouth as he caught the ball and threw it again, each impact leaving a barely visible mark on the expensive stone. Nick's blood pressure spiked immediately. This building represented everything he had worked for, every sacrifice he had made, every relationship he had prioritized below success. The marble facade alone had cost his company over $3 million, imported directly from Italian quarries and installed by master craftsmen. The sight of this unkempt child treating it like a playground wall was an insult that cut deep into his carefully constructed world of order and control. "Hey!" Nick's voice boomed across the plaza, causing several passing pedestrians to turn and stare. "You, kid!" He strode forward with purposeful steps, his face flushed with indignation. The boy looked up, startled, clutching the rubber ball against his chest with small hands that seemed too fragile for the harsh world around him. Lucas Chen had been at the hospital since 5 in the morning, watching machines beep and hum around his father's bed, while his mother dozed fitfully in an uncomfortable plastic chair. The nurses had suggested he get some fresh air, and his mother, exhausted from weeks of maintaining a bedside vigil, had agreed that a short walk might do him good. He hadn't wandered far, just 3 blocks from Seattle General Hospital, when the impressive building with its smooth walls had caught his attention. The ball was his only companion, a birthday gift from his father during happier times, and bouncing it helped quiet the anxiety that had become his constant companion. "What do you think you're doing?" Nick demanded, towering over the small boy like a thundercloud ready to unleash its fury. His shadow fell across Lucas, blocking out the morning sun and creating an intimidating presence that would have sent most adults scrambling for apologies. "This isn't a playground, kid. This is private property, and you're damaging it with that thing." Lucas looked up at the angry man with wide, dark eyes that held a maturity far beyond his 6 years. "I'm sorry, mister. I was just playing. I didn't know I wasn't supposed to." His voice was soft, almost a whisper, and carried the distinctive accent of someone who had learned English as a second language. I can go somewhere else. But Nick was far from finished. The morning's frustrations, the pressure from his board of directors, the endless demands of running a corporation that employed thousands of people, all of it came pouring out in a torrent of misplaced anger directed at this small, innocent target. Sorry isn't good enough. Do you have any idea how much this building cost? How much that wall cost? Your little game is causing damage that will cost thousands to repair. The boy's lower lip began to tremble, but he stood his ground with a courage that might have impressed Nick under different circumstances. I really am sorry. I didn't mean to hurt anything. I was just trying to not think about. His words trailed off as tears began to gather in his eyes. I don't care what you were trying to do. Nick's voice rose even higher, drawing more attention from passers-by, who slowed their steps to witness the spectacle. Where are your parents? Don't they teach you respect for other people's property? Don't they supervise you? The mention of his parents was like a knife twisting in Lucas's small chest. His father lay 3 blocks away, tubes running into his arms and a machine helping him breathe, while his mother hadn't left the hospital in days, except to grab coffee from vending machines. The tears that had been threatening now spilled over, running down his cheeks as he struggled to find words that might make this angry man understand. My daddy is... Lucas started, but his voice broke completely. The rubber ball slipped from his grasp and rolled across the plaza, coming to rest against the base of a decorative fountain that Nick had personally selected from a catalog of architectural elements that cost more than most people spent on cars. Nick felt a momentary flicker of something that might have been conscience, but he quickly pushed it aside. In his world, weakness was not tolerated, and teaching children early about the consequences of their actions was simply preparing them for reality. Your daddy what? Let me guess. He doesn't care where you are or what you're doing? Well, this is what happens when parents don't do their jobs. The words hit Lucas like physical blows. His small frame shook with sobs as he tried to form words between gasping breaths. My daddy is dying, he finally managed to whisper, the admission torn from him like a confession under torture. He's in the hospital, and the doctors say he might not. He couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't give voice to the fear that had been consuming him for weeks. But Nick was too caught up in his own anger to register the significance of what he had just heard. The pressure of maintaining his position at the top of Seattle's business elite, the constant demands from shareholders, the never-ending cycle of meetings and decisions that affected thousands of lives, all of it had created a shell around his heart so thick that genuine human emotion couldn't penetrate it. I don't want to hear your sob stories, kid. Everyone has problems. That doesn't give you the right to damage other people's property. Lucas wiped his nose on the sleeve of his worn jacket, a piece of clothing that had clearly seen better days and had been washed so many times that the original color was barely discernible. His sneakers had holes in them, held together with duct tape that his mother had applied with careful precision to make them last just a little longer. Everything about his appearance spoke of a family stretching every dollar, making difficult choices between necessities, and trying to maintain dignity in the face of overwhelming circumstances. Please don't call the police, Lucas pleaded, his voice barely audible above the morning traffic. I'll go away and never come back, I promise. My mom has enough to worry about without getting in trouble too. Nick's expression softened for just a moment at the mention of police, a flicker of recognition that perhaps his reaction had been disproportionate to the offense. But his pride wouldn't allow him to back down completely, not with a growing crowd of onlookers witnessing what had already become a public spectacle. Just get out of here, he said, his voice still harsh, but lacking some of its earlier venom. And don't let me catch you around here again. Lucas nodded frantically, rushing to retrieve his ball from beside the fountain. His small legs carried him away from the plaza as quickly as they could manage, leaving Nick standing alone in the morning sun, with the disapproving stares of several passers-by burning into his back. One elderly woman shook her head in disgust as she walked past, muttering something about bullies and innocent children that Nick pretended not to hear. As he walked toward the entrance of his building, Nick tried to push the encounter from his mind and focus on the day ahead. He had a board meeting at 9, a conference call with investors in Tokyo at 11, and a lunch meeting with potential acquisition targets that could add another $100 million to his company's annual revenue. These were the things that mattered, the tangible measures of success that had driven him since his early 20s when he had first tasted the intoxicating power of financial achievement. The lobby of Baird Industries was a monument to modern corporate excess, with marble floors that reflected the light from crystal chandeliers, abstract art pieces that cost more than most people's homes, and a reception desk carved from a single piece of rare Honduran mahogany. Nick's personal elevator was waiting, programmed to recognize his approach and open automatically, whisking him to the 40th floor, where his corner office commanded a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Wanda mountains beyond. His assistant, Margaret Henley, a woman in her 50s who had been with the company for over a decade, greeted him with her usual professional smile and a steaming cup of coffee prepared exactly to his specifications. "Good morning, Mr. Baird. The quarterly reports are on your desk, and the Henderson Group called to confirm this afternoon's meeting. Also, there were 3 messages from the foundation requesting your presence at next week's charity gala." Nick accepted the coffee and nodded, but his usual focus seemed fractured this morning. The image of the small boy's tear-streaked face kept intruding on his thoughts, along with something the child had said that Nick's anger had initially obscured. Something about his father being in the hospital, about dying. The memory nagged at him like a persistent headache, refusing to be dismissed, despite his efforts to concentrate on more important matters. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and decisions, but Nick found his attention wandering at odd moments. During the board meeting, while listening to presentations about market penetration and profit margins, he caught himself staring out the window toward the general direction of the plaza where the encounter had occurred. The boy's words echoed in his mind with increasing clarity. "My daddy is dying." The raw pain in that small voice, the desperate plea not to involve the police because his mother had enough to worry about, these details that his anger had initially blocked now demanded attention. By lunchtime, Nick's usual appetite had deserted him completely. Instead of his planned meeting at the Four Seasons, he found himself walking the streets around his building, ostensibly checking on property security, but actually searching for something he couldn't quite define. The plaza was empty now, showing no trace of the morning's drama, except for a small scuff mark on the marble wall where the rubber ball had made contact. Margaret had worked for enough powerful men to recognize the signs of internal conflict, and when Nick returned to the office with his lunch untouched and a distracted expression that was entirely unlike his usual laser focus, she decided to risk a gentle inquiry. "Is everything all right, Mr. Baird? You seem unusually preoccupied today." Nick considered dismissing her concern with his typical brusque efficiency, but something about the morning's encounter had shaken loose feelings he had spent years suppressing. "Margaret, there was an incident this morning, a child, playing outside the building. I may have been, perhaps I overreacted slightly." Margaret had witnessed her boss's temper on numerous occasions, had seen him reduce grown men to stammering apologies, had watched him terminate employees for minor infractions without a moment's hesitation. The admission that he might have overreacted, particularly with a child, was so out of character that she struggled to formulate an appropriate response. "The child mentioned his father was in the hospital," Nick continued, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I'm wondering if perhaps there might be more to the situation than I initially understood." The afternoon crawled by with unusual sluggishness, each meeting feeling like an exercise in going through the motions, rather than the high-stakes decision-making that usually energized Nick's days. His mind kept returning to details he hadn't fully processed in the moment. The boy's worn clothing, the careful way he had handled the rubber ball as if it were precious, the mature vocabulary that suggested intelligence despite his young age, and most persistently, the genuine terror in his voice when he had begged Nick not to call the police because his mother had enough worries. As evening approached, Nick made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of heading home to his penthouse apartment overlooking the Sound, he walked the 3 blocks to Seattle General Hospital. He wasn't entirely sure what he hoped to accomplish, but something was driving him forward with an urgency he couldn't explain or ignore. The hospital's emergency department was a controlled chaos of medical professionals, worried families, and the constant background hum of life-saving equipment. Nick approached the information desk with his usual confidence, but found himself at a loss for how to phrase his inquiry. He couldn't exactly explain that he was looking for a dying man whose 6-year-old son he had made cry that morning. "I'm looking for information about a patient," he began, then realized how inadequate that sounded. A man, probably Asian, with a young son. The boy mentioned his father was seriously ill. The receptionist, a tired-looking woman who had clearly fielded thousands of similar vague inquiries, looked up at him with practiced patience. "Sir, we have dozens of patients matching that description. Do you have a name, a room number, any specific information that might help narrow it down?" Nick felt foolish, realizing he had acted on impulse without considering the practical challenges of his mission. He was about to apologize and leave when a small voice from behind him said, "Mister, are you the man from this morning?" He turned to see Lucas Chen standing beside a vending machine, a small cup of hot chocolate in his hands, and the same worn jacket hanging loosely on his thin frame. The boy's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but there was no anger in his expression, only a weary sadness that seemed far too heavy for someone so young to carry. "Yes," Nick said quietly, his earlier aggression completely absent. "Yes, I am. I came to see if, how is your father?" Lucas looked up at him with those same dark eyes that had haunted Nick's thoughts all day. "The doctors say he's very sick. They're doing everything they can, but—" His voice trailed off, as he struggled with concepts that most adults found difficult to process. "What's wrong with him?" Nick asked, surprising himself with the gentleness in his own voice. "He has something called leukemia," Lucas replied, pronouncing the word carefully, as if he had practiced it many times. "It's a kind of cancer in his blood. The doctors gave him medicine that made him very sick, but it was supposed to make the cancer go away. Only it didn't work very well, and now they say he needs a different kind of treatment that costs a lot of money." End quote. The words hit Nick like a physical blow. Leukemia. He knew that disease, had watched it steal away the most important person in his childhood, with the same relentless efficiency that characterized all of nature's cruelest jokes. Suddenly, the morning's encounter took on an entirely different meaning, and Nick felt the foundations of his carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crack. "What's your father's name?" Nick asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "David Chen," Lucas replied. "But his friends used to call him Dave. He told me he had a best friend when he was little. Before his family moved here from California. He said they promised to always be friends, but then they lost touch when they grew up. Daddy always wondered what happened to him." The world seemed to tilt sideways as Nick processed this information. David Chen. Dave. His childhood best friend who had lived 3 houses down from Nick's family in the small town of Bellingham, Washington. The boy who had taught Nick how to ride a bike, who had shared his lunch money when Nick forgot his at home, who had sworn they would be friends forever, even when Dave's family announced they were moving to Los Angeles for his father's job. They had been 8 years old then, and despite their promises to stay in touch, the demands of growing up in different cities had gradually eroded their connection, until it existed only in increasingly distant memories. "David Chen from Bellingham?" Nick whispered, his voice barely audible above the hospital's ambient noise. Lucas looked up with sudden interest. "Yes. How did you know? Did you know my daddy?" Nick felt his legs grow weak, and he sat down heavily in one of the waiting room chairs. "Lucas, what's your last name?" "Chen. Lucas Chen." "And your father, does he have a small scar on his left hand from when he fell off his bike?" Lucas's eyes widened with amazement. "Yes. How did you know that?" Nick buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by a cascade of emotions he had spent decades learning to suppress. Guilt, regret, shame, and a grief so profound it threatened to consume him entirely. "Because I was there when he got that scar. I was the one who dared him to ride down Maple Street Hill without using his brakes. I was his best friend, Lucas. My name is Nicholas Baird, but he used to call me Nicky." The recognition dawned in Lucas's eyes like sunrise breaking over mountains. "You're Nicky? Daddy talks about you sometimes. He says you were the smartest kid he ever knew, and that you could fix anything that was broken. He wondered if you became an engineer or a scientist or something important like that." The irony wasn't lost on Nick. Dave had been right about him becoming something important. at least by society's standards. But somewhere along the path to success, he had lost the essence of who he used to be, the boy who had cared more about friendship than profit margins, who had measured wealth and shared adventures rather than stock options and quarterly earnings reports. "Can I see him?" Nick asked, his voice thick with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Lucas nodded eagerly, suddenly animated by the possibility of bringing his father some joy in what might be his final days. "He's in room 47. Mama is with him. She'll be so surprised to meet you." They rode the elevator in relative silence, Lucas clutching his hot chocolate and Nick grappling with the magnitude of what was about to unfold. He hadn't seen Dave in 30 years, hadn't even thought about him regularly until this moment, when the past collided with the present in the most unexpected and painful way possible. The successful CEO who commanded respect and fear in boardrooms across the country suddenly felt like an 8-year-old boy again, nervous about disappointing his best friend. Room 47 was a standard hospital room, but it felt like a sanctuary of quiet desperation. Medical equipment surrounded the bed where Dave Chen lay sleeping, his once robust frame now diminished by months of aggressive treatment. His skin had the pale, translucent quality that spoke of a body fighting a battle. It was slowly losing, and the steady beep of monitors provided a rhythmic soundtrack to his struggle. Beside the bed sat a woman Nick immediately recognized as Lucas's mother. Though exhaustion had carved lines around her eyes, and worry had aged her beyond her years. She looked up as they entered, her expression shifting from mild curiosity to surprise as she took in Nick's expensive suit and obvious affluence. "Mama, this is Nicky," Lucas announced with the excited whisper of a child sharing an important secret. "Daddy's best friend from when he was little. Remember the stories?" The woman, who Nick would later learn was named Susan, stared at him with a mixture of amazement and something that might have been hope. "You're the Nicky from Bellingham? The one who helped David build that treehouse?" Nick nodded, unable to trust his voice as memories flooded back with painful clarity. The treehouse had been their summer project when they were 9, a masterpiece of childhood engineering constructed from scrap lumber and held together by determination and friendship. They had spent countless hours in that wooden refuge, planning adventures and sharing dreams that seemed limitless in their scope and possibility. "I can't believe it," Susan continued, rising from her chair with obvious effort. "David has talked about you so many times over the years. He always wondered what became of his best friend Nicky." "I became exactly what he probably expected," Nick said quietly, his usual pride in his accomplishments feeling hollow in this context. "But I'm not sure it was worth what I gave up to get there." At that moment, Dave's eyes fluttered open, focusing slowly on the figures gathered around his bed. For a moment, confusion clouded his features as he tried to process what he was seeing. Then recognition dawned, and despite his weakened condition, his face transformed with a joy so pure it took Nick's breath away. "Nicky?" Dave's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried 30 years of unspoken friendship. "Is it really you?" Nick moved closer to the bed, his throat tight with emotions he hadn't experienced since childhood. "Hey Dave, I heard you were causing trouble again." Dave's laugh was weak but genuine, the same infectious sound that had brightened Nick's childhood and made every adventure seem possible. "You always were the funny one. I can't believe you're here. How did you find me?" The question hung in the air, and Nick found himself faced with a choice. He could explain about the morning's encounter, about his shameful behavior toward Lucas, about the chain of events that had led him to this moment of reckoning. Or he could simply be present, be the friend that Dave needed in what might be his final days. "Lucas told me you were here," Nick said, which was true enough without revealing the full complexity of the situation. "I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I should have found you years ago." "We lost touch," Dave said, his hand reaching out weakly toward Nick. "It happens. People grow up, move away, get busy with their lives. But you're here now, and that's what matters." Nick took his friend's hand, shocked by how frail it felt compared to his memories of the strong, adventurous boy he had once known. "Dave, I need to tell you something. I've become successful, very successful. I run a company now, and I have resources. I want to help with your medical bills, with whatever you need." Dave's eyes filled with tears, but he shook his head slightly. "Nikki, you don't understand. The treatments, the experimental therapy they want to try, it costs over $800,000. Even if you're doing well, that's not the kind of money most people have lying around." Nick squeezed his friend's hand gently. "Dave, my company is worth over $2 billion. $800,000 is what I spend on office furniture. Please, let me do this. Let me help my best friend." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion and possibility. Susan began crying quietly, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of hope where none had existed moments before. Lucas, not fully understanding the financial implications, but sensing the importance of the moment, moved closer to his father's bed. "Daddy, does this mean you're going to get better?" Lucas asked with the innocent directness that only children possess. Dave looked at his son, then at Nick, and finally at his wife. The experimental treatment wasn't a guarantee. The doctors had been clear about that. But it offered possibilities that hadn't existed an hour earlier, a chance to fight when they had been preparing to surrender. "It means we're going to try everything we can, buddy," Dave said, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "And Nikki is going to help us." Over the next hour, Nick learned about the journey that had brought the Chen family to this point. Dave had followed his childhood dreams of becoming a teacher, specializing in elementary education, with a focus on helping children from immigrant families navigate the American school system. Susan worked as a translator for the court system, helping non-English speakers understand legal proceedings that could dramatically impact their lives. Together, they had built a modest but meaningful life, centered around service to their community and devotion to their son. The leukemia diagnosis had come 18 months earlier, initially caught in routine blood work that revealed irregularities Dave's doctor wanted to investigate further. The first round of treatment had seemed promising, and for several months, they had dared to hope that the nightmare might be ending. But cancer, as they learned, was a cunning opponent that adapted and evolved, finding new ways to threaten everything they held dear. The experimental treatment offered by Seattle General represented their last realistic option, a cutting-edge immunotherapy that had shown promising results in clinical trials, but carried a price tag that placed it beyond the reach of a teacher's salary and health insurance coverage. They had been preparing to mortgage their small house, liquidate Dave's retirement savings, and rely on the generosity of friends and family, knowing that even these desperate measures would fall far short of what was needed. "I've been lying here thinking about regrets," Dave confided to Nick as the evening wore on. "All the things I wished I had done differently, people I should have stayed in touch with, dreams I let slip away because they seemed impractical or impossible." Nick understood completely, though his regrets ran in different directions. "I thought success would make me happy," he admitted. "I thought if I could just make enough money, build a big enough company, prove myself to the world, then everything else would fall into place. But I've been miserable for years, Dave, successful and miserable." "What happened to the boy who built tree houses and fixed broken toys?" Dave asked gently. "I buried him under quarterly reports and board meetings," Nick replied. "I convinced myself that caring too much was a weakness, that emotional attachments would interfere with the hard decisions that success required. I became exactly the kind of person we used to make fun of when we were kids." Susan had been listening to their conversation with growing understanding. "David told me about your friendship," she said to Nick. "How you two were inseparable, how you brought out the best in each other. He said you were the kind of friend who would do anything to help someone you cared about." "I used to be," Nick said quietly. "I'm hoping I still can be." The next morning, Nick arrived at the hospital before visiting hours officially began, using his influence and a substantial donation to gain early access. He found Dave awake and alert, looking somewhat stronger after his first full night's sleep in weeks. The knowledge that his son's future was no longer hanging in the balance had lifted a weight that medicine alone couldn't address. "I spoke with Dr. Martinez this morning," Nick reported, settling into the chair beside Dave's bed. "The experimental treatment can begin as soon as next week. I've also arranged for you to be transferred to a private room with better amenities for Susan and Lucas." Dave's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, but he managed to maintain his composure. "Nikki, I don't know how to thank you. This is beyond anything I could have imagined." "Don't thank me yet," Nick said with a smile that carried echoes of their childhood friendship. "Thank me when you're healthy enough to help me build another treehouse for Lucas." The mention of the treehouse sparked something in Dave's eyes, a glimmer of the adventurous boy who had once believed anything was possible with enough imagination and determination. "You know, I still have the plans we drew up for the ultimate treehouse." Lucas found them in a box of old papers and made me explain every detail. "Plans change," Nick said, thinking about his own life and the unexpected turn it had taken. "But the important things, the things that really matter, those stay the same." Over the following days, Nick found himself spending more and more time at the hospital, initially to handle the logistics of Dave's treatment, but increasingly because he genuinely wanted to be there. He discovered that Lucas was remarkably intelligent for his age, with a curiosity about the world that reminded Nick of his younger self. The boy asked endless questions about Nick's business, about technology, about how things worked, displaying the same insatiable hunger for knowledge that had once driven both Nick and Dave to explore every corner of their, quote, small town. Susan proved to be equally impressive, speaking 4 languages fluently and possessing a deep understanding of legal procedures that had made her invaluable to Seattle's immigrant community. Nick learned that she had given up a more lucrative position with a large law firm to work for the court system because she believed in the importance of ensuring justice was accessible to everyone, regardless of their ability to speak English or navigate complex legal systems. The Chen family's apartment, which Nick visited to collect some personal items for their extended hospital stay, was a modest 2-bedroom space in a building that had seen better decades. But it was filled with evidence of a rich family life. Lucas's artwork covering the refrigerator, family photos documenting camping trips and birthday celebrations, bookshelves lined with volumes in both English and Mandarin, and a sense of home that had been entirely absent from Nick's expensive penthouse. "We've been happy here," Susan explained as Nick looked around the small space. "It's not much, but it's been enough." Nick thought about his own living space, with its panoramic views and designer furniture, its silence and emptiness, its complete lack of anything that spoke to genuine human connection or joy. "Sometimes enough is everything," he said, surprising himself with the admission. The experimental treatment began on a Tuesday morning in early November, with Dave displaying the same courage he had shown as a child when facing playground bullies or attempting dangerous bicycle stunts. The immunotherapy involved a complex process of extracting some of his white blood cells, genetically modifying them to better fight the cancer, and then reintroducing them to his system. It was cutting-edge medicine that offered hope, but guaranteed nothing except discomfort and uncertainty. Nick found himself taking an increasingly active role in coordinating Dave's care, using his business connections to ensure access to the best specialists, and his resources to eliminate the financial stress that could interfere with healing. But more importantly, he found himself rediscovering parts of his personality that had been dormant for years. The executive who had terrorized employees with his perfectionism began spending his afternoons reading stories to Lucas, teaching him basic programming concepts, and listening to his dreams of becoming either a doctor, like the ones helping his father, or an inventor who could create machines to help sick people. "You know," Dave observed during one of Nick's visits, "you're starting to sound like the old Nicky again. Is that good or bad?" Nick asked. "It's real," Dave replied. "The other version, the angry businessman I heard about from the nurses, that wasn't really you. This is who you were meant to be." The conversation forced Nick to confront the gradual transformation he had undergone over the past decades. Success had come with a price he hadn't recognized until now, requiring him to abandon qualities that had once defined his character. Somewhere along the way, the boy who had cried when he accidentally stepped on an ant had become a man who could fire dozens of employees without feeling a moment's remorse, justifying it as necessary for the greater good of the company's health. "I've hurt people," Nick admitted, "made decisions that prioritized profit over people's lives. I've become someone I wouldn't have liked when we were kids." "But you're still here," Dave pointed out. "Still capable of changing, still capable of caring about something other than your bank account. That has to count for something." The treatment progressed slowly, with good days and bad days, creating an emotional roller coaster for the entire family. Nick found himself canceling meetings to be present during particularly difficult moments, delegating responsibilities he had never trusted to anyone else, and gradually restructuring his priorities in ways that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. Margaret, his assistant, noticed the changes immediately. "Mr. Baird," she said during one of their planning sessions, "your calendar looks completely different than it did a month ago. You've declined 3 major speaking engagements and postponed the acquisition talks with the Henderson Group. The Henderson Group will still be there next, quote, month," Nick replied, realizing as he said it that his old self would have considered such a statement tantamount to business heresy. Some things are more important than closing deals. The comment represented a fundamental shift in Nick's worldview, one that extended beyond his friend's medical crisis to encompass his entire approach to life and business. He began looking at his company's policies through a different lens, questioning practices that prioritized shareholder returns over employee welfare, examining the human cost of decisions that had previously seemed purely financial in nature. One particularly meaningful change involved the company's health insurance policy. Nick discovered that several of his employees had been struggling with medical expenses not covered by their existing benefits, situations that eerily paralleled what the Chen family had been facing. Without fanfare or publicity, he expanded the coverage to include experimental treatments and increased mental health benefits, changes that would cost the company several $1 million annually, but would potentially save lives and families. "Why the sudden interest in employee benefits?" asked James Morrison, Baird Industries' chief financial officer, during a routine meeting. "These changes will significantly impact our profit margins. Maybe it's time we redefined what we consider profit," Nick replied, surprising both Morrison and himself with the sentiment. What good is a profitable company if the people who make it possible can't afford to take care of their families? The question lingered in the conference room long after the meeting ended, challenging assumptions that had guided corporate policy for years. Nick realized he was beginning to view success through an entirely different framework, one that measured value in human terms rather than purely financial ones. As December approached, Dave's response to the treatment began showing encouraging signs. His blood counts were improving, his energy levels were slowly returning, and the doctors expressed cautious optimism that the experimental therapy was achieving its intended effects. The transformation wasn't dramatic or immediate, but it represented hope where none had existed before. Lucas celebrated his 7th birthday in the hospital, but it was far from a somber occasion. Nick had arranged for the pediatric ward's common room to be decorated with balloons and streamers, and he surprised the boy with a custom-built computer designed specifically for children to learn programming. The gift came with a promise. When Dave was well enough to come home, Nick would teach Lucas how to build websites and simple games. "This is the best birthday ever," Lucas announced, his eyes bright with excitement as he explored his new computer. Even being in the hospital can make it bad. Nick felt his throat tighten with emotion as he watched the boy's pure joy, remembering how it felt to find wonder in simple gifts rather than measuring everything by its monetary value. When had he lost that capacity for simple happiness, that ability to be genuinely excited about something without calculating its return on investment or strategic value? "Uncle Mickey," Lucas said, using the title that had emerged naturally over the past weeks. "When Daddy gets better, will you come to our house for dinner? Mama makes the best dumplings in the whole world." The invitation was simple, casual, the kind of offer that Nick's old life would have required him to decline due to scheduling conflicts or social obligations he deemed more important. But, sitting in that hospital room, surrounded by evidence of genuine love and family bonds, he couldn't imagine anything that could possibly take priority over homemade dumplings and the company of people who had reminded him what truly mattered in life. "I would be honored to come to dinner," Nick replied, and meant it completely. As the weeks passed, Dave's improvement became more pronounced. The experimental treatment was working better than anyone had dared to hope, and the doctors began discussing timelines for discharge and long-term care plans. The news filled the hospital room with an atmosphere of cautious celebration, tempered by the understanding that cancer was a cunning adversary that could return without warning. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Susan confided to Nick during one of their quiet conversations while Dave slept, and Lucas worked on homework assignments that Nick had been helping him complete. This all seems too good to be true, too much like a fairy tale. Nick understood her caution completely. His own life had been built on the premise that good things came with hidden costs, that every success required sacrifices that might not be apparent until much later. But watching Dave's gradual recovery, seeing Lucas's excitement about his father's improving health, witnessing the family's resilience in the face of overwhelming challenges, he was beginning to believe that sometimes good things happened simply because they were needed, not because they had been earned through struggle or purchased with sacrifice. Maybe fairy tales are just stories about what happens when people care enough to make magic possible, Nick suggested, surprising himself with the whimsical sentiment. The conversation was interrupted by Dave stirring awake, his color noticeably better than it had been even a week earlier. The hollowed cheeks were filling out slightly, his eyes had regained some of their old sparkle, and his voice carried strength that had been absent for months. "What are you two plotting over there?" Dave asked with mock suspicion, though his smile indicated genuine pleasure at seeing his wife and best friend getting along so well. "We're planning your homecoming celebration," Susan replied, moving to take his hand. "The doctors think you might be able to come home before Christmas." The news hit Dave like a physical blow, but this time it was joy rather than despair that overwhelmed him. For months, he had been preparing himself and his family for the possibility that he might not see another Christmas, that this holiday season might be their last together. The prospect of going home, of sleeping in his own bed and eating meals at his own table, seemed almost too wonderful to believe. "Christmas at home," Dave repeated, as if testing the words to see if they would disappear like a mirage. "I was so afraid that Lucas would remember this Christmas as the one when Daddy died in the hospital. This is going to be the Christmas when Daddy came home," Lucas announced from his corner of the room where he had been pretending to focus on his math homework while actually listening to every word of the adult conversation. "And Uncle Nicky is going to help us put up our Christmas tree because Mama can't reach the tall branches and you're still too tired to lift heavy things." The assumption that Nick would be part of their Christmas celebration was stated so matter-of-factly that no one thought to question it, including Nick himself. Somewhere over the past weeks, he had been absorbed into this family's life so completely that his presence had become expected rather than merely welcomed. The realization should have triggered his usual claustrophobia about emotional commitments and personal obligations, but instead, it filled him with a warmth he hadn't experienced since childhood. "I'd love to help with your Christmas tree," Nick said, then added with a grin that recalled their boyhood adventures, "as long as Dave promises not to dare me to climb to the very top like he did when we were 9. "That was a perfectly reasonable dare," Dave protested with mock indignation. "You were the one who decided to see if you could hang the star while doing a handstand." The memory sparked a flood of similar recollections, stories of childhood adventures and mishaps that had Susan and Lucas laughing until tears ran down their cheeks. Nick found himself remembering not just the events themselves, but the feelings associated with them. The sense of unlimited possibility that had characterized those early years when friendship was the most important thing in the world, and tomorrow always held the promise of new discoveries. As Dave's discharge date approached, Nick began making arrangements that went far beyond medical logistics. The Chen family's small apartment, while filled with love, was hardly suitable for someone recovering from intensive medical treatment. The stairs were steep, the bedroom was cramped, and the building's heating system was unreliable at best. Without consulting anyone, Nick began searching for alternative living arrangements that would better support Dave's recovery while respecting the family's independence and dignity. "I found a house," Nick announced during one of his evening visits, producing a tablet with photos of a modest but comfortable 3-bedroom home in a quiet neighborhood with good schools and easy access to the hospital. "For follow-up appointments. It's available for a long-term lease, and the rent is very reasonable." Susan looked at the photos with obvious appreciation, but her expression carried the wariness of someone who had learned to be suspicious of offers that seemed too good to be true. "Nick, this is beautiful, but we can't afford something like this. Even with Dave getting better, it will be months before he can go back to work, and my salary alone won't cover rent on a place like this." "The rent is $300 a month," Nick said casually, as if he hadn't spent the previous afternoon negotiating with the actual owner to accept that amount, while secretly paying the difference himself. It's been on the market for a while, and the owner is motivated to find reliable tenants who will take good care of the property. Dave studied the photos with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust good fortune without understanding its true cost. "Mickey, what aren't you telling us? Houses like this don't rent for $300 a month in Seattle, not unless there's something seriously wrong with them." Nick had anticipated this question and prepared an answer that was technically truthful, if not completely transparent. "The owner is someone I know through business connections. He's more interested in finding the right family than maximizing rental income. Think of it as a favor to me as much as to you." The explanation satisfied Dave's immediate concerns, while allowing Nick to maintain the fiction that this was simply a fortunate panacea. Coincidence, rather than another example of his determination to ensure his friend's family had everything they needed for a successful recovery. The house was actually owned by one of Nick's subsidiary companies, purchased specifically for this purpose, but such details seemed unnecessarily complicated when the important thing was providing Dave with a comfortable environment for healing. Lucas's reaction to the house photos was unrestrained delight. "Look, Daddy! It has a backyard, and that tree looks perfect for climbing, and there's a garage where Uncle Nicky can park his fancy car when he comes to visit." The boys' assumptions about Nick's continued presence in their lives were stated with such certainty that objecting would have seemed churlish. Nick realized that somewhere along the way, he had indeed become Uncle Nicky, a role that carried responsibilities and rewards he was only beginning to understand. The transformation from angry CEO to honorary family member had happened so gradually that he could barely remember what his life had been like before Dave's illness had reunited them. Dave's homecoming was scheduled for December 22nd, just 3 days before Christmas. Nick took the unusual step of closing his offices early that week, giving his employees extended holiday time while he focused on ensuring every detail of the transition went smoothly. He had arranged for a medical transport service to handle the journey from hospital to home, stocked the new house with groceries and household necessities, and even hired a cleaning service to ensure everything was perfect for their arrival. The morning of the discharge, Nick arrived at the hospital to find the entire family in a state of excited anticipation mixed with nervous energy. Dave was dressed in regular clothes for the first time in months, looking thin but alert. His color improved enough that the casual observer might not immediately recognize him as someone who had been fighting for his life just weeks earlier. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and find out this was all a dream," Dave confided as they waited for the final paperwork to be completed. "6 weeks ago, we were preparing for the worst. Now I'm going home for Christmas. It doesn't seem real." "It's real," Nick assured him, though he understood the feeling completely. His own life had been transformed so dramatically that he sometimes felt like he was living someone else's story, one with a very different ending than the path he had been following for the past 2 decades. The transport to their new home was accomplished without incident, though Nick noticed Dave's careful attention to every detail of the journey, as if he were memorizing the experience of traveling through his city as a healthy man rather than a patient. When they pulled up in front of the small house with its neat yard and welcoming front porch, Susan began crying again, overwhelmed by the reality of this new chapter in their lives. "It's perfect," she whispered, taking in the Christmas decorations Nick had arranged to be installed while they were en route from the hospital. "It looks like a home." Lucas was out of the car before it had completely stopped, racing around the yard and examining every tree, bush, and garden feature with the thoroughness of a surveyor mapping new territory. His excitement was infectious, and even Dave managed to walk the perimeter of the property without assistance, marveling at the space and privacy after months of hospital confinement. Inside, the house was everything Nick had promised, and more. The furniture was comfortable without being ostentatious, the kitchen was well equipped for family meals, and Lucas's bedroom had been decorated with space themes and educational posters that reflected his interests in science and technology. Most importantly, the master bedroom was on the ground floor, eliminating the stairs that would have been problematic during Dave's recovery. "There's one more surprise," Nick announced, leading them to the living room where a Christmas tree stood in the corner, undecorated but perfectly proportioned, and filling the room with the scent of fresh pine. "I thought you might want to decorate it together, as a family." The tree decorating became an impromptu celebration of survival and hope. Susan produced ornaments that had been carefully packed away in their old apartment, each one carrying memories of previous Christmases and family traditions. Lucas directed the placement of every decoration with the seriousness of an artist arranging a masterpiece, while Dave supervised from a comfortable chair, his strength not yet fully returned, but his spirits soaring with each ornament that found its place on the branches. Nick found himself assigned the task of handling the higher branches, a role that felt both familiar and completely new. As a child, he had been the designated tree topper in his own family, tall enough to reach the upper branches, but still young enough to approach the task with appropriate reverence for its importance. Now, as an adult helping to create Christmas magic for Lucas, he rediscovered the satisfaction that came from contributing to something beautiful and meaningful, rather than merely profitable. "Perfect," Lucas announced when the last ornament was in place. "Now we just need Uncle Nicky to put the star on top." The star was a simple affair, probably purchased at a discount store rather than a high-end boutique, but it gleamed with significance as Nick lifted it toward the tree's uppermost branch. For a moment, he was 8 years old again, standing on a stepladder in his childhood home, while his parents watched with pride, and his best friend Dave cheered from the living room couch. Then he was back in the present, surrounded by a family that had claimed him as their own, and given him something he hadn't even realized he was missing. "There," he said, stepping back to admire their handiwork. "Now it's officially Christmas." The following days passed in a blur of quiet domesticity that was entirely foreign to Nick's usual holiday experience. Instead of corporate parties and networking events, he found himself helping Lucas build elaborate structures with building blocks, teaching him simple card games, and listening to Dave's stories about his years as a teacher and the children whose lives he had touched through his dedication to education. Susan proved to be every bit as remarkable as her husband and son, displaying a strength and grace that had carried her family through their darkest period while never losing sight of the things that truly mattered. She cooked meals that transformed simple ingredients into celebrations of flavor and culture, shared stories of her own childhood in Taiwan, and her parents' courage in immigrating to America with nothing but hopes for a better future, and demonstrated daily the kind of love that creates homes rather than merely houses. On Christmas Eve, Nick found himself invited to participate in family traditions that had been maintained even during the hospital months. They read Christmas stories together. Lucas curled up between his parents, while Nick occupied the comfortable armchair that had somehow become designated as his spot. They shared memories of previous holidays, talked about plans and dreams for the future, and celebrated the simple miracle of being together and healthy. "I have something for you," Dave said, as the evening wound down, producing a small, carefully wrapped package. "Susan helped me with it while I was in the hospital." Nick opened the gift to find a framed photograph of two young boys standing beside a wooden treehouse, their arms around each other's shoulders and their faces bright with the joy of shared accomplishment. He recognized the picture immediately, though he hadn't seen it in decades. It had been taken by Dave's mother during the summer. They completed their masterpiece of childhood engineering, capturing a moment of pure happiness and friendship that had somehow survived 30 years of separation. "I found it in my mother's things after she passed away," Dave explained. "She kept it all these years, said it was one of her favorite pictures because it showed what real friendship looked like." Nick felt tears threatening as he studied the photograph, remembering not just that specific day, but the entire summer of planning, building, and dreaming that had culminated in their treehouse's completion. Those boys in the picture had believed they would be friends forever, had promised to stay in touch no matter how far apart life might take them, had sworn that nothing would ever change the bond between them. "We did stay friends," Nick said quietly. "We just forgot for a while." Christmas morning dawned clear and cold, with a light dusting of snow that transformed the neighborhood into a winter wonderland perfectly suited for Lucas's first Christmas in their new home. Nick arrived early, as had become his habit, bearing gifts that reflected his growing understanding of what the family valued most. For Lucas, there was a set of advanced building blocks designed to teach engineering principles, along with a promise to help him build whatever he could imagine. For Susan, a collection of cookbooks featuring recipes from around the world, acknowledging her love of creating meals that brought people together. For Dave, something much more personal: the deed to the house they had been renting. "Nick, what is this?" Dave asked, staring at the legal document with confusion and growing amazement. "It's your house," Nick replied simply. "I know you've always wanted Lucas to grow up somewhere stable, somewhere he could climb trees and have friends over and build memories that will last his whole life. Now he can." The gift represented more than just property transfer. It was Nick's recognition that this family had given him something far more valuable than anything money could purchase. They had reminded him who he used to be, who he could still become, and what actually mattered in a life well lived. The house was simply his way of ensuring that the place where he had rediscovered his humanity would always be there when he needed to remember these lessons. Susan burst into tears again, but they were tears of joy and gratitude, rather than the fear and exhaustion that had characterized so many of her emotional moments over the past year. Dave sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what had just happened, while Lucas bounced around the room with excitement that was only partially related to understanding the significance of home ownership. "This is too much," Dave finally managed. "Nick, you've already saved my life, taken care of my family, given us more than we could ever repay. This is beyond anything we could accept. You saved my life too," Nick replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I was dying just as surely as you were, just in a different way. I was successful and miserable, rich and empty, accomplished and completely alone. You and Susan and Lucas, you gave me back everything I had lost without even realizing it was missing." The conversation was interrupted by Lucas launching himself into Nick's arms with the full force of 7-year-old enthusiasm. "Uncle Nicky, does this mean you'll always be part of our family, even when I grow up and have kids of my own?" The question, asked with such innocent directness, cut straight to the heart of what had been happening over the past months. Nick had indeed become part of this family, not through obligation or charity, but through genuine love and mutual need. They had rescued each other in ways that went far beyond medical bills and housing arrangements. "Always," Nick promised, hugging the boy tightly. "Uncle Nicky will always be part of your family." The rest of Christmas Day passed in a haze of happiness that Nick had never experienced as an adult. They cooked together, played games together, shared stories and laughter, and the kind of comfortable silences that only came with complete acceptance and belonging. By evening, as they sat around the Christmas tree with its twinkling lights and carefully placed ornaments, Nick realized that this was what he had been searching for his entire adult life, without even knowing it. "I need to make some changes," Nick announced as they cleaned up wrapping paper and prepared for a dinner of leftovers and continued celebration. "In my company, in how I live, in what I consider important. These past months have shown me that I've been measuring success all wrong." "What kind of changes?" Dave asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the direction of Nick's thoughts. "I want to step back from day-to-day operations, focus on projects that actually help people rather than just generating profits. I want to establish a foundation, maybe work with families facing medical crises like yours. I want to remember every day what you've taught me about what actually matters." The plans that emerged over the following weeks were ambitious, but grounded in the practical experience of watching one family navigate an impossible situation with grace and determination. The Baird Foundation would focus on providing comprehensive support for families dealing with serious medical diagnoses, covering not just treatment costs, but also housing, transportation, childcare, and the 1,000 other expenses that accumulated when life suddenly revolved around hospitals and uncertainty. Nick restructured his role at Baird Industries, promoting capable executives to handle daily operations while he focused on strategic planning and corporate social responsibility initiatives. The company's employee benefits were expanded dramatically, profit-sharing programs were implemented, and a culture of work-life balance was actively promoted rather than merely tolerated. Most importantly, Nick made sure that his own life reflected the values he had rediscovered through his friendship with the Chen family. He sold his sterile penthouse apartment and bought a modest house just 6 blocks from Dave and Susan, close enough for regular family dinners and spontaneous visits, but far enough to respect their privacy and brat independence. The changes weren't always easy or immediately successful. Some shareholders questioned the wisdom of prioritizing employee welfare over maximum profitability. Some longtime business associates struggled to understand Nick's new approach to corporate leadership. And Nick himself occasionally fell back into old patterns of thinking that prioritized financial metrics over human considerations. But every time he felt himself slipping back toward his old ways, he had only to think about Lucas's tears on that morning outside his building, or Dave's courage in facing his illness, or Susan's strength in holding her family together through their darkest period. The memory of who he had been before their reunion served as a constant reminder of the kind of person he never wanted to become again. 6 months after Dave's discharge from the hospital, the experimental treatment was declared a complete success. The cancer was in full remission. Dave's strength had returned to nearly normal levels, and the doctors expressed confidence that he would enjoy many more years of healthy life with his family. The news was celebrated with a backyard barbecue that brought together friends, neighbors, medical staff who had become extended family, and colleagues from both Dave's school and Nick's company. "A year ago, I thought my story was ending," Dave said during an impromptu speech as the sun set over their celebration. "I thought I was going to leave my wife and son to face the world without me, and that was the most terrifying prospect I could imagine. Instead, I found out that my story was just beginning a new chapter, one that brought my best friend back into my life and showed me what miracles look like when they happen to ordinary people." Nick found himself thinking about that first morning encounter with Lucas, how different everything might have been if he had taken just a moment to really see the child instead of focusing only on his own irritation and sense of injured dignity. How many other opportunities for connection and growth had he missed over the years by prioritizing his own immediate concerns over genuine human interaction? "I yelled at a little boy for playing outside my building," Nick said when his turn to speak arrived. "I was angry and impatient and completely focused on things that didn't matter at all. That little boy was Lucas. And his courage in the face of his father's illness taught me more about strength and grace than 30 years of business success ever could. Sometimes the most important lessons come from the people we least expect, in moments when we're least prepared to receive them." End quote. As the evening wound down and guests began to head home, Nick found himself alone with the Chen family in their backyard. Watching Lucas chase fireflies between the trees that were already showing signs of becoming perfect for climbing as he grew older. The scene was peaceful and complete, in a way that Nick's previous life had never been, filled with the kind of contentment that couldn't be purchased or achieved through willpower alone. "Do you ever miss it?" Susan asked, settling into the chair beside him. "The old life, the corporate excitement, being at the center of big deals and important decisions?" Nick considered the question carefully, thinking about the adrenaline rush of closing major acquisitions, the satisfaction of seeing quarterly reports that exceeded expectations, the respect and fear that his reputation had commanded in business circles. There were aspects of his former life that had been genuinely rewarding, challenges that had engaged his intelligence and ambition in ways that felt meaningful at the time. "I miss feeling important," he admitted. "I miss the sense that what I was doing mattered on a large scale, that I was building something significant. But I've learned that there are different ways to matter, different kinds of significance. Helping one family survive a crisis, being present for a child's birthday party, sharing a meal with people who care about you as a person rather than as a source of profit. These things matter too. Maybe they matter more." The conversation was interrupted by Lucas running up to them with a jar containing several captured fireflies, their gentle glow creating a miniature light show in the gathering darkness. "Look what I caught! Can I keep them as pets?" "Fireflies need to be free to be happy," Dave explained gently, approaching the group with the careful movements of someone still rebuilding his strength but no longer afraid of losing it. "But we can watch them for a few minutes before we let them go." They sat together in comfortable silence, 4 people who had found each other through circumstances that none of them would have chosen, but all of them now treasured. The fireflies pulsed with their ancient rhythm, temporary captives in a child's jar, but destined for release into the summer night where they belonged. Nick thought about his own journey from captivity to freedom, how success had trapped him just as surely as Lucas's jar contained the fireflies. The difference was that he had built his own prison, constructed it deliberately from ambition and fear and the mistaken belief that achievement could substitute for genuine human connection. "Thank you," he said quietly, addressing all three members of the family who had unknowingly rescued him from a life that looked successful from the outside but felt empty at its core. "For what?" Lucas asked, looking up from his jar of captive light. "For reminding me how to be human," Nick replied, then helped the boy unscrew the lid so the fireflies could return to their proper place in the world. As the last firefly disappeared into the darkness, Nick realized that his own transformation was similarly complete. The angry, isolated CEO who had yelled at a child for playing outside his building was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true success was measured in relationships rather than revenues, in moments of genuine connection rather than quarterly growth statistics. He was Uncle Nicky now, part of a family that had claimed him not because of what he could provide, but because of who he could become when surrounded by love and acceptance. It was the best promotion he had ever received, and the only one that truly mattered. The story of Nicholas Baird and the Chen family became something of a legend in Seattle's business community, though the details were often exaggerated or misunderstood in the retelling. Some focused on the dramatic medical rescue, others on the real estate generosity, and still others on the corporate culture changes that Nick implemented at Baird Industries. But for those who knew them personally, the real story was simpler and more profound. It was about a man who had lost his way and found it again through the love of a family that had needed help but ended up providing healing. It was about second chances and the courage to change, about the difference between success and significance, and about the truth that sometimes the most important journeys begin with a single moment of genuine human connection. And sometimes, when Lucas Chen is playing in his backyard, and a rubber ball bounces against the fence, he remembers the angry man who taught him that even adults can learn to be better, that friendship can survive decades of separation, and that the best families are often the ones we choose rather than the ones we're born into. Uncle Nicky always keeps his promises, especially the ones about being family forever.